initiated, try to talk about the kinds of things that we would try to do in this first year of the program, and getting the core out there, getting people aware of it, what kinds of things we could do. And part and parcel of that was the notion that we wanted to do things that would facilitate the development of the capacity on this campus for faculty and graduate students to be writing grants. And part of that process, we talked about the fact that every year the Vice Chancellor of the Research Office has a grant writing seminar that they put on. That if you haven't been to it, it's a very, very useful seminar. I found that even after many, many years of being involved in grants, that there were a few pieces of advice that I thought were very useful in terms of how to format or package a grant proposal. So part of what we decided to do in conjunction actually with SSP and then the start of our Behavioral Health Program of Excellence Initiative was to put a couple of very preliminary, very introductory kinds of presentations together for all of you that could serve as a lead-in to the workshop that the Vice Chancellor for Research has scheduled during the fall break. I believe it's scheduled for the Tuesday, October 17th. And so I would suggest that if you are interested and haven't signed up, that you can go to the VCR's Vice Chancellor for Research website, and you can sign up there for that seminar. And it's right there free, and it's a day-long seminar. It's very, very useful. So basically, what we're trying to do here is really in this session is to give you a very quick orientation to funding opportunities and mechanisms at the National Institute of Health. I'm focusing just on the National Institute of Health partly because that's the behavioral health emphasis part of this. Clearly, there are other funding mechanisms and other funding groups that we'll be looking at through and supporting through SSP, particularly things like the National Science Foundation, National Institute of Justice, National Institute of Education. And a lot of what we're talking about applies fairly equally well to those other entities also, but I think it's useful to recognize that at least today we're going to be only looking at National Institutes of Health kinds of issues. Next week, we'll build on what we're doing today to look at the structure of National Institute of Health applications and a little bit about the formatting of the application and the elements that have to be in an application and where you can go on this campus to get help for some of those pieces. We'll also talk about something that will be new to a lot of you, just because it's new to a lot of us who've been doing research for some time. We'll spend a little time next week looking at the new electronic submissions protocols that are being slowly put into place for National Institute of Health grants. And as I mentioned already, this should hopefully lead to some nice background, especially for new investigators to lead into the October 17th workshop. The specific topics today, I guess I can use this pointer. I've never got to use one of these, that's pretty neat. Is to really just give you a little bit, a very quick overview of what the National Institutes of Health cover, particularly some of the institutes and centers within the National Institute of Health, where it might be logical if you're looking for social science research funding. We're going to talk very briefly about what are the funding mechanisms, just so you get a little bit used to the language and where to look and what to look for. What are the funding approaches? And a lot of that, particularly for new investigators, for graduate students, for new faculty, they have a lot of mechanisms that are designed and targeted specifically for early career faculty and for faculty development. And I think it's interesting and important to kind of understand as you start thinking about grants, which mechanisms are most appropriate for where you're at and at your level of the career development. Then we're going to talk a little bit about where you can go, and your handout includes some of the websites you can go to get some more information about what we're talking about today. And then also we'll talk a little bit about where you can get help here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So those are the objectives that hopefully we'll get through in about 40-45 minutes today, and then a little time for discussion or questions at the end. When you think about the National Institutes of Health, there are actually 27 different institutes and centers, and I didn't attempt to list them all here. I tried to go through and pick some of them that I thought would be of more potential interest in application for faculty on this campus, but many of you, depending on your interest, may well have other agencies that you're aware of. For example, the National Cancer Institute. I mentioned that one because I spent some time over the past 5 years serving on a review panel for the National Cancer Institute, where they have a specific program in place to try to fold in more social and behavioral researchers into doing basic prevention, intervention kind of research on cancer. And they also have a big push on doing research on health disparities. And both of those are areas where social science researchers can make a big contribution. National Institute on Aging traditionally has done a lot of work in areas that would be of interest to social sciences. We have quite a few people on this campus that have interest in substance use and abuse in terms of research. National Institute on Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism is funding some research on this campus presently. National Institute of Child and Human Development is I believe, Julia, that's the grant that the agency is funding your large infertility grant. National Institute of Drug Abuse is funding quite a bit of work on the campus, both in terms of intervention work and basic research. Similarly, National Institute of Mental Health and the National Center on Minority Health and Health Disparities. They're doing some very interesting work. I served a review panel with them 2 summers ago, doing a lot of interesting work on community-based participatory research, a lot of outreach-based research. But if you go to the National Institutes of Health website, you can see links to all of the various agencies that are out there. And there are many agencies, many of them participate in the same kinds of programs. And we're not really going to be looking at program announcements today. We're going to be talking about it, but next time we'll be looking at some program announcements, and you're going to be able to see that on any particular program announcement, there may be multiple agencies participating. And so you can kind of take a look at both the general focus of what people are looking for research in and then particular emphasis of the agencies. And part of the challenge in writing and developing a grant is coming to understand the interface between what the agency is looking for and what the general announcement is asking for. But there are many, many places out in the National Institutes of Health that fund basic social science research that don't necessarily require us to have a biomedical or medical component. Although there's a lot more emphasis these days on interdisciplinary collaboration, and to the extent that you can run over to the University of Nebraska Medical Center and make some connections, probably for certain types of projects that would be very beneficial. There are 3 basic funding mechanisms in this process of National Institute of Health that fund extramural research. There's basic one that we spend most of our time and effort concentrating on, which are the grants. And these are basically investigator initiated, designed on what kind of research is to be developed. Clearly you do it, and we're going to see this in a little while, in response to various opportunities that are out there, but it really is investigator driven. Another opportunity is our contracts. We don't do nearly as many of those here, and they don't fund nearly as many of those of you. If you're looking at the overall portfolio from the National Institute of Health, about 85 to 88% of the funding goes to grants, and a relatively small proportion, about 10% or so, goes to contracts. And there's a special mechanism we'll talk about a little bit later where the government announces bids for contracts. And then cooperative agreements. And they're similar to grants, but they usually, the awarding institute or center recipient have some substantial involvement in carrying out the project activities together. Those are often, you see cooperative agreements oftentimes in terms of coordinating efforts. For example, I've been working with a group that has a coordinating center that's supporting research that's being done on adolescents violence prevention efforts. And there's a cooperative agreement with one particular university that kind of coordinates the activities of all of the 22 grantees that are spread out around the country. But again, those are fairly rare. Only about 5% of the funding out of NIH is a cooperative agreement type funding. Now, when we talk about grants, one of the things you're going to do is, part of today is to help you just understand the language and the terminology that's used oftentimes, and help you get an orientation towards that. There are 4 basic funding approaches, one of them being the most predominant one in terms of funding is investigator initiated. that you as an investigator, if you have a good idea and you feel that it fits within the mission of one of the agencies, that's the reason you really knowing about the institutes and centers and going out and looking at what it is that they're funding, what they're interested in funding. You can submit proposals during the review submission timelines and find, and basically suggest, here's something that I think is responsive to the issues that you're concerned with, and this is what I'd like to do. The other mechanism, the other approach is a basic program announcements. Now, program announcements, and I'm going to come back and talk about them in a little more depth in a moment, oftentimes are similar in many forms to investigator-initiated, but they're more broadly based. There are requests for applications and requests for proposals. And I've got individual screens on those, so then I'll just go ahead and skip to those and kind of look at them in a little bit more detail. Again, the investigator-initiated research tends to be considered as unsolicited research, but as you'll see on the next screen, that when we talk about program announcements, the program announcements are where the National Institute of Health solicits grant applications or cooperative agreements in a given research area. That basically typically represents an ongoing or expanded interest or a high priority program, something that they're interested in pursuing. Typically for program announcements, they last for a period of time. They don't have a specific set aside amount of money, and the programs that are, many of the programs are renewed, and so they'll be around for 10 years, those types of things. But they're often considered investigator-initiated because program announcements generally are pretty broad. And then within the breadth of what they're looking at, you pretty much define what's interesting. So for example, one that I'm curious about right now and that I've been taking a look at is a program announcement that's come out in the last year about doing basically human subjects ethics considerations in National Institute of Health research. And it turns out that several of the agencies that I've looked at for funding in the past, National Institute of Mental Health, National Institute of Drug Abuse, National Institute of Alcohol and Alcohol Abuse, are agencies that are participating in this particular program announcement. And within that context, they give some examples of what kinds of research they're interested in, but fundamentally, it turns out to be pretty much investigator-initiated. If you have an interesting idea about some aspect of human subjects protocols and want to put in and design a good project, and then oftentimes you're going to be thinking about how does it fit with a particular agency. So if you're doing it with the National Institute of Drug Abuse, it may be around issues that are specific to the kinds of measurement, the kinds of research that's done at that agency. But most of what you're going to typically respond to are these more broadly based program announcements. In particular, as junior investigators, for those of you in the room who are in that status, it's a much wiser path to choose initially, partly because of the more targeted opportunities are more time delimited and also often more competitive in terms of the pool of money. And that's exactly what I want to go next then, is with requests for applications. These are also solicited like the program announcements. But these are basically where they're soliciting research grant applications for a one-time initiative, one-time competition on a specific topic. They tend to be a little more focused than program announcements, and more specifically, they oftentimes have set-aside awards and then a certain amount of funding that's available, or a number of grants that they're going to fund. And having served on review panels, I've come to be a little more suspect of some of these, or not suspect in terms of not being done well, but understanding what the competition level is like. The last time that I was on a review panel for an RFA, we had 86 applications, and we were told that no more than 8 of those applications would be funded. And so, a 10% funding rate is a much lower hit rate than you would find typically if you were responding to an RFA. So it tends to be also disadvantageous if you're relatively new and inexperienced in an area and you're developing your ideas. Most grants, and we'll talk more about this next week, but most grants you're not going to get funded the first time around. And usually it's the second or even the third time before you get funded. And you only get 3 tries. There's a 3-strike rule with grant submissions. But the basic idea here is that with RFAs, you don't get 3 tries. RFAs are a single time limited mechanism. Oftentimes there's just one shot that you apply, or maybe just 2 times, and then they're off the page. And so if you devote a lot of effort to these and then you don't get it, you could certainly redesign it to try to go in as an unsolicited, but then you're starting over again with a different review panel and so on. The RFAs also tend to have very specialized review panels, and we'll be talking a little bit more about review panels next time and kind of about how that mechanism works. The other mechanism we talked briefly about is the research request for proposals. These we very seldom are involved in because these are where NIH is soliciting research contracts. So again, it's a very small part of the larger the grant portfolio from NIH. And unless you tend to be somebody who's a contractor and providing certain kinds of services, the people who would be more likely to respond to this would be, maybe like Ian Newman's alcohol center. There might be a contractor that would be put out to do certain kinds of evaluations in schools, and established research operations might be able to do that. But again, they're not very typical. They're certainly not typical for newer investigators. But again, sometimes people, this is one of the most often asked questions when I start talking to people about RFAs and RFPs is, well, what's the difference? The difference is an RFP is a contract solicitation. Now, within that general framework, another piece of the language that you have to understand to kind of get a feel for the topology of grants is understanding the various, what they call funding activities. And within NIH, there are multiple funding activities. I'm not going to try to go through all of them. I'm going to point to a few of them, give you a general overview. Later on, I'll show you a link where you can find more of them. The traditional research project grant is an R01. And again, this is kind of the language that you hear people talking about a lot. Say, well, I'm going to submit an R01. When you first are sitting around people who are working on grants, and you're wondering, what language are they speaking, and should I know what an R01 is? Well, an R01 grant is basically grants that are awarded to an investigator and eligible institutions that support a specific discrete research project that's related to the investigator's area of interest that they've proposed. Most of the largest category of funding activities within NIH agencies are R01 grants. Now, R01 grants, all of these various mechanisms have various types of parameters associated with them. With R01 grants, the typical parameters are that it can be no more than 5 years. It can be up to 5 years. It doesn't have to be 5 years. I've been involved in like 3-year R01s. But you can submit a grant for up to 5 years of funding. The maximum award typically is $500,000 per year. Now, I want to make 2 comments about that. The $500,000 per year is direct. That's direct funding. That's the money that would come to an investigator for carrying out the proposed research activities. That does not include, and it's not folded in like you have with some agencies where the indirect has to be counted as part of your direct. Now, what's indirect? Well, indirect is that the university and federal government have agreements that basically, in exchange for providing the researcher with an office and with access to a library and with the latest in computer technology and other kinds of support like SSP, get the plug in there, that the indirect helps to provide support for that kind of infrastructure. So every university and basically every entity that's funded by the National Institutes of Health has an indirect agreement with the federal government. Now, indirect agreements vary from institution to institution. Here at the University of Nebraska, the current indirect is 44%, I think, and I think it's either going to go up 0.5% or
I think it's 49.
40 what?
I think it's 49.
49? Has it gone up that much?
It's right at 50.
But anyway, there's a rate, and they would know it. Norm Broughton and the folks over that we'll talk about next time who do the grant accounting know exactly what the percentage is, and it changes pretty much annually. The federal government comes in, they look at how much space we've allocated for research, all these kinds of things, and then come up with a rate that is specific to an institution. A lot of the institutions here in the Midwest have rates that run from about 40 to 50%. You can get to some of the major East Coast schools or West Coast schools, and you find that some of them have 50, almost 60% indirect rates and so on. When your grant is funded, then let's say you had a $100,000 grant and the indirect is 49%, then essentially $149,000 would come to the university. The investigator would get $100,000 of it, and then the indirect would go to the university to be administered in ways that the university administers that. And I'm not going to get into the nuances of that today, but in terms of the funding, to understand that if you did a 5-year grant, an R01 grant, and they requested the maximum of $500,000 a year, the actual amount of the award would be more than the $250,000. It would be the $250,000 plus the amount of percentage of overhead. Now, having said that, there are a couple other nuances about funding that I'm just going to touch on here before we go into the other mechanisms. But you can occasionally get permission to go above $500,000 per year. You have to get permission to do that under the R01s. But if you can contact your program officer, you can make arguments, and it's possible that you can get permission occasionally to go in a little bit over that amount. Now, one of the other funny kind of asides, just this is down the road, it's a worry that we all love to have. But once you get funded, and you get your final notice of award, you usually won't get what you asked for. You'll get what you asked for minus some percentage. I've been on grants that have cut us only 5%, but I've been on grants where they've cut us 20%. And essentially the federal government will come in and say, we really like your project, we approve it, go do it, and here's 80% of the money you asked for to do it. And then one of the first things an investigator has to do is sit down and figure out, okay, now, how am I going to do this for 80% of the money? And you oftentimes, one of the first tasks is sitting down and figuring out where you can cut, where you can make adjustments, and those kinds of things. It's a very interesting process. Yes?
So does that mean this was padded to begin with?
This is being taped. No, I think you have, there are people who do that, who ask that question about, well, is that a way to deal with it? The problem is no, generally you can't do that because of the fact that you just don't ask for $500,000. If you're asking for that much money, you've got to give a detailed budget and detailed justification. And we'll look a little bit at that part of the mechanism next week. But you're actually going to have to lay out, here are all the people I'm going to hire. Here's what it costs to pay them. Oh, by the way, here's what their benefits are. Well, little things like that you're going to have to learn how to do. It's not just what your salary is. And you can't just decide, okay, let me give you an example. A lot of times we think about, oh, somebody could be hired to teach my class for $4,000. Well, that's not the way the colleges work usually. If somebody's going to be hired to teach a class, the department's going to have to pay a percentage, so you're going to have to pay a percentage off your grant. You're also not going to have to just pay a percentage of your salary, you're also going to have to pay all of your benefits. If you hire staff at whatever their salary is plus their benefits, which right now for most of the non-clerical staff in this university, there's about 33%. So all those things have to be figured into a budget. You have to give budget narratives. You have to say, I'm hiring a project manager. The project manager will be doing this during year 1. During year 2, the project manager will be doing this and this and this. And you basically, so the answer is that they can go through your budget and look at it and say, wait a minute, you're buying 10 new computers. Shouldn't the university be providing computers as part of the indirect? And so unless you can make a special argument for why those computers are needed on this grant outside of that, then those are the kinds of things that they also go through in line item veto. Now, it's probably a little bit easier to have that flex that you're asking about if you go to lower grants, lower dollar amounts. If your grant is under $250,000 a year, $250,000 sounds like a lot of money. But if it's under $250,000 a year, then your grant can go in on a modular budget. And you don't have to do all this line item specification of how many computers for how many dollars, and how many staff hours of this person for how much money. You can use a modular budget where basically you just allocate, you basically ask for money in packets of $25,000. And that, so there are some advantages if you're doing smaller grants to think about keeping it under $250,000 a year, so you don't have to get into all of the budget detail and all the budget justifications. But generally speaking, yes, when you're budgeting grants, you should be anticipating that there's going to be a cut. Most of us experience cuts between 10 and 15% fairly routinely. And if you didn't at least think about, if you're doing your whole project on a shoestring, thinking, well, if I really stretch, if I can do this and I do this and I do this all myself, I can manage to bring it in on budget. That's probably not going to work when you get the 10% cut, because you don't have the flex left. So it is an important thing to think about. Now, when we look at other mechanisms, the R01 mechanism tends to be for a more experienced investigator, although there clearly are, I should mention that there clearly are programs in place to help new investigators along. If you serve on a review panel, the review panels now identify who the new investigators are, and the reviewers are supposed to take that into consideration in reviewing proposals. So even on R01s, there's a little bit of a recognition of new investigators. But if you're really getting started off and you just need a little bit of money to begin to get your program going, R03 grants, the small research grants, tend to be a much better mechanism to use. They support small research projects that can be carried out in a short period of time. What do we mean by small? Typically, the limits on R03s are $50,000 a year direct for up to 2 years. They not all of the institutes and centers accept R03 proposals, so it kind of varies from institute to center. It is a good way. And those institutes that do have them, oftentimes they're specifically targeted for new investigators. For example, I served on the National Cancer Institute R03 grant review panel. And on that panel, our mandate was, the priority was supposed to go to funding proposals for brand new investigators who were just starting off their careers, or for more experienced investigators who were moving their research into cancer when they had been doing research in other areas previously. So the premium was put on trying to bring people into the field, fund people. The R03s tend, in some of the agencies, they even have a more of an accelerated review cycle so that you get word back a little bit faster about whether or not you're funded. So there's some advantages to them. And they're a very good thing to look at for newer investigators. Another way that is interesting to both fund new investigators as well as experienced investigators doing new and novel and innovative kinds of things are the exploratory developmental research grant mechanisms, the R21s. And that basically tends to encourages applications for research projects that involve an especially high degree of innovation or novelty. Something that may not work. You might have a new approach to measuring social networks in a high-risk population, for example. And you're not sure whether or not that's something that, if you pitched an R01, the grant review team might go, we really aren't convinced this methodology is going to work. So you might turn around and say, I want to do a smaller R21 grant to demonstrate that we can actually do this and to test it and show that it's a feasible approach. R21s, maximum of 2 years of funding, maximum of $275,000 over the 2 years. Now, because it's $275,000 over the 2 years, it can be more 1 year and less the next. It is modular budgeting, so it's a much easier process to budget that way. That's a change for some of you who have experienced and been around for a while. The R21s used to be 3 years and $300,000. So that was a change they made about 4 years ago, I believe, in terms of the funding cycle on these. But again, if you've got something that's a little more innovative, a little more cutting edge, that hasn't been tested, now really what you have to do though is make the point, it's not that you don't know how to do it. is that in general this hasn't been done, not just that you specifically haven't done it. So if it's not new and cutting edge to everybody else, the fact that it's new and cutting edge to you won't be a sufficient argument. But again, R21s are not a bad mechanism for junior investigators, a way to look at getting started. We have one of the investigators who's been working, he came to Nebraska a couple of years ago to work with us on some of our American Indian research, and we wanted to try to see if we could adapt the model we've been using with one culture to another culture. And he was able to get an R21 funded, a good first grant for him to kind of get his career off to a start. Some other mechanisms, particularly for students to look at, are things like the individual, what they always call the Kirstein National NRSA, National Research. Now I'm forgetting what the initials stand for. But anyway, these are basically awards for predoctoral investigators that provide an opportunity for developing a research career, getting it off to a good start. One of our sociology graduate students just got a F31 funded this year on Melissa Walls. And it's a very good opportunity, provides very nice funding for graduate students, better stipends than you get for other graduate work. And so at the time, you really need to be, and you have to, for most of these awards, you have to be at the dissertation level, kind of, and ready to basically be ABD to move into these types of work mechanisms. But they provide salary and some research support, and the dollar amounts vary from agency to agency, and they're not really big dollars, but we're talking, I think, oftentimes in the $25,000, $35,000 range per year in terms of awards. There's also well, this is a little bit more about it. One of the things that's important with the F-31s is that you have to be under the supervision of a mentor, and it really, really helps. It makes it much more likely that you're going to get funded if your mentor is somebody who's an established investigator who's got funded research. That's because they're going to be known to the review panel. They're going to be recognized that they have the kind of ability to help bring you along as the next generation of researchers. There's also individual postdoctoral awards, the F-32 mechanisms. And this is, again, depending on the particular agency. Some of the agencies have F-32, some of them don't. By the way, in terms of reviews, a lot of the kinds of awards that we're talking about are reviewed by very, very broadly based review panels. But in some cases, like for example, in the National Institute of Drug Abuse, they have a special review panel that only reviews these predoctoral, postdoctoral, and early career types of awards. It looks very much at understanding the training components of these. One of the things about an F-31 and an F-32, and the next mechanism that I want to mention, well actually the next couple I want to mention, there's the dissertation award mechanism, which is not as widely used as the F-31s and F-32s. You find a lot of agencies that are giving predoctoral and postdoctoral support. The R36 mechanisms, I've only been able to find a couple of agencies right now that are funding R36 dissertations, other than in some of the agencies where they have special minority dissertation awards. But the more broadly based R36s are not as common right now. It comes and goes with the various agencies. But the other mechanism I wanted to talk about is a really good mechanism for early career faculty is the KO1 awards, which have to be awarded, I believe, within the first 5 years of an academic career, the first 5 years post-PhD, basically. And they're designed to be a training. They're designed to provide some protected time for developing the research program. Clearly, you have to have your feet on the ground and establish some early record to show that you're capable of dealing with this. You have to design the program in such a way that it's very clear who your mentors are going to be and where your training is going to be. One of the things that young investigators like about the KO1s is that they require that 75% of your time you spend on research. And so the people who get KO1s early in their careers are not doing a lot of teaching, they're doing a lot of research. We have, in sociology, Kim Tyler has a KO1, in psychology, Dave DeLillo, and I think Martin Kivenany both got KO1s. They're great mechanisms for early investigators. They provide salary support and a small amount of money, around $50,000 a year, I think, for other kinds of training and research activities. So most of the people, plan to do some data collection and some new data collection processes. A big part of a KO1 award is the idea is at the end of the 5 years, you're writing RO1 applications. So really designed to take new people, bring them along, give them the training and the skills needed so that they become the next generation of people writing research grants. Now these are, the ones that I've gone over are just a few of the mechanisms. There's a lot of others. There's center grants, for example, the P category, like P20s, P50s, things like that. But those are much more group kinds of activities. There are other individual awards, like the KO awards. I mentioned the KO1, which is really the one that's appropriate for new investigators. There's a KO2, which is a mid-career award. There's a KO5, which is a senior researcher award. So there's a lot of other mechanisms, and one of the things you can do is to take a little bit of time to go to some of these sites. They're on your handout, but if you're taking a look at, there are a couple of places that are useful to go look at. The Grants Opportunity page at the National Institute of Health is a good place to just go find out about, in general, support for grants. If you're a new investigator, you're kind of new to all of this, you'll go in there and there's a section there that specifically target the new investigators. You go in there and you'll see what kinds of support programs are there, what kinds of special opportunities are there. This is a big initiative with the institutes. They want to bring new investigators into the fold. And there's a big commitment across the board for institutes and centers to come up with funding mechanisms and, like I mentioned before, even on traditional funding mechanisms like R01s, to target or to tag new investigators. So, and basically cue the review panels into recognizing that this is not somebody who's been as a seasoned investigator, but as a first-time applicant. The extramural research page provides a lot of information and links to the actual announcements, what kinds of awards are out there. And that's where you can go in and talking about the mechanisms I was talking about earlier. You can go in and look at, well, what's out there in terms of program announcements? What's out there in terms of requests for applications? And you can go in and you can look at that by agency, you can look at that by types of announcements. When you go in and look at the specific announcements, I'll be bringing in some examples of announcements at the next meeting. You can actually then see which agencies are participating, those kinds of things. And similarly here, the NIH funding page, which actually gets much more specifically into timelines, application processes, and so on. Talks a lot about the grant mechanisms. One of the things that we're going through an interesting transformation right now. Until about a year ago, all grants that were submitted to the National Institutes of Health had to go in on a PHS 398 form, a standard paper form. And you'll learn that there are certain kinds of required elements, required order, limitations on length, things like this. For example, in a traditional R01, the body of the grant, and this is part of, like I said, we'll focus on this much more next week, the body of the grant is limited to 25 pages. And it has to have certain margins, has to have certain font characteristics, and so on. On certain applications, some of the R03s, for example, and some of the R21s are limited to 10 pages. So that there are all of these types of requirements. But recently what they've done is they've now moved to a new setup where they have the R03s and the R21s are now have to be submitted electronically. So you have to work with our grants office here to do electronic submission. There's a whole new setup, a whole new set of forms. You have to download some special software to do some of the forms in sort of templates online, and then the rest of the material has to be submitted electronically. If there are things that you don't have electronically already, they're going to have to be scanned and prepared to be submitted electronically. So for those of us who've been doing projects for years and are starting to make this transition, and all of a sudden we're finding we haven't already gone back and scanned the articles that we want to put in the appendix, or we don't have PDF copies of those articles, it's a good time to go get them, because we're moving in this direction. I don't know exactly when the timeline for R01's transforming to the electronic system. It's coming very soon. I think it's in the next year. Yeah. We're not far off from seeing that. So This is also a good place to find out some information about what those mechanisms look like. On campus, you know, there are a lot of resources here that you should be looking to utilize, and I did manage to put SSP at the top of the campus resources here. I mean, part of the logic behind designing this was the SSP effort was the notion of developing the kinds of support that people would need to write grants. There are other places on campus that do a very good job of providing support. The Nebraska Center for Research on Children, Family, Youth, and Schools is a very useful center. They particularly are focused more on research around these particular substantive topics, but it's a pretty wide range of topics. They have a great web page. Their web page lists links to funding resources that are specific to the areas that they're emphasizing. And they have technical support for grant development and so on. We have the Office of Proposal Development here on campus that does a lot of work, including a lot of work helping us write proposals. And they're very useful in helping you know what you need to do to get a proposal out the door. If you give them adequate warning and lead time, they can help by editing a proposal and helping you tighten it up, make it look better. Also, the Office of Research webpage here, the Vice Chancellor's webpage, has a specific area for funding announcements. It's another place you can go, and I think that plugs you right into the federal listings. There are many other kinds of listings. The Office of Research, for example, you can get on their email list if you want a weekly email of grant opportunities. You can also connect right to NIH and get a weekly email from NIH telling you what some of the grant opportunities are. So those are a couple of basic resources. And then, you know, I just was going to try to close off today by you know, again, thinking of, assuming a lot of you are relatively new at this, that there are a few basic things that I've learned over the years of working with grants. And the first thing is that writing a grant is not like writing even a research paper. You think about how long a research paper can take if you've written a research article. A grant's much more involved, it takes a lot more time. You have to plan ahead. Typically, it's going to be months. So when you see a program announcement come out, you think, I want to go do that, you know, you have to recognize that you're probably not going to sit down and do that in a month or two. It typically takes a long time to do everything that it takes to pull together a good competitive grant proposal. Second point seems pretty obvious, but you know, choose funding opportunities that are appropriate to your interest in your career stage. Don't go chasing money. You know, think, what is it that you're interested in doing? And if you have an interest in a particular substantive area, then you go out and say, where are the opportunities within that area that fit, that I could respond to, that when somebody looked at my Vita as part of the application, they could see that this is a direction that I've already started to move, that this is consistent with my career path. And this is something where I already have some established interest and record. Probably the biggest thing, I think the biggest mistake I see people making is not seeking advice from people around you. There are a lot of people on this campus who've gotten grants funded, a lot of people who've gone through this process. And not just, you know, formally through SSP or through the Family Center or through other mechanisms on campus, but just around your department, other people who've been funded. You need to get advice and input and suggestions, and you need to listen to people. Most of the people around that have done this are very happy to share what they've learned, and it is a process, and it is one that is very demanding in terms of understanding some of the nuances that we really haven't gotten into. And the other thing I would suggest is probably really important is to use the support services and resources that are available. When you write a grant, it doesn't mean that you are doing this all by yourself or alone. You're going to be, if you're the principal investigator on a grant, you're going to be the person who's coming up with the basic idea and designing it. But you don't have to design it in a vacuum. Some of the best proposals I've seen at the front end in terms of the theoretical model fall apart when they get to the part of the proposal where it says research, design, and methods. As you'll learn next week, that's about 60% of your proposal. And it's the part that the review panel is the most critical of. And oftentimes, you're, especially when you're early in your career, you're going to have good skills in terms of the basic theoretical model and interest you have, but maybe you haven't gone out and collected your own data. Maybe you haven't designed a sample for a particular type of survey. You've worked with other people who've done it, but you haven't done it yourself. One of the things is you don't have to do these things yourself. And in fact, generally speaking, it's wise not to. If you look at most people around this campus who have successful grants, and especially people who have R01s funded, you're not finding people that are lone rangers. They're working with teams, they build teams, and they work with, in terms of narrative, like the Office of Proposal Development, in terms of data collection, units like the Bureau of Sociological Research, statistical modeling, power estimates. There are things that you're going to have to do in a grant proposal that most of us are not necessarily comfortable doing. But if you're doing data collection on a grant, and you don't have a power narrative in your grant, if you don't have a paragraph or a page or whatever, depending on how complicated it is, if you're not talking about the statistical power of your sample for your models that you're planning to test, you're not going to get funded. Now that doesn't mean you have to spend 6 months going out and learning how to, reading Cohen and learning how to do power calculations. What you do is you find somebody that can help you with that. And you need to find them early enough in the process so that you don't design a whole project around a sample of 300 because your mentor told you 300 is a nice number to have. And all of a sudden, 2 weeks before you're ready to submit your grant, you sit down with your consultant that you found out about and thought, well, maybe I should go talk to Walt here and see what he can help me with. And Walt says, well, with the effect size you have, you really need a sample of at least 600. And then you're running back and trying to redo everything at the last minute. Or if you're doing a telephone survey and somebody's told you, well, telephone surveys, you can usually do those for about $10 an interview. And so you build this in, you build it in your planning, you do your budget, and then 2 weeks before you submit your proposal, you go over to the Bureau of Sociological Research and you tell Julia that you need to do 1,000 interviews at $10 a person, and she tells you good luck. She's much more sensitive. But the point is that
we'll give you 500.
You need to build, you need to figure out where you're strongest at, where you need help, and you need to line that help up early. And the really nice thing is that SSP and some of the other efforts on this campus are designed exactly to do that, to provide the help, to start helping, provide the infrastructure for you to figure out what you need. And they're not always going to have the expertise here, but they're going to be able to say, well, here's where you're going to have to go for that expertise. And depending on how big and how complicated your grant is, you may have to go some distance. Anyway, that wraps up what I was going to talk about. Since people are running out of the room now, I'm going to stop. Are there any questions I can answer?
And I actually support research in foreign country or people researching in foreign country.
Doing research in a foreign country?
Yes.
I think that there are some stipulations around it. I'm not real knowledgeable about them, but certainly it's supported. NIH does. I've been involved over the years with a couple of projects that have had either split samples. Where one project that I consulted on back at Iowa State was a project where they were looking at economic stress and mental health problems, and half of the project was being done with rural farm families in Iowa, and half was being done in the Czechoslovakian Republic with rural families. In our American Indian research here, the Les Wibenex project, some of our work is being done with First Nation groups in Canada. And I do know that there's extra processes that you have to go through to do research on foreign sites. And it gets a little messier sometimes with, institutional review board kinds of approvals and those kinds of things, and establishing what are the criteria in the international site, and are they different than the criteria here, and kind of working out the nuances of that. But they do fund it, and I think probably the biggest thing would be for a particular mechanism that, we're going to talk a little bit, actually your grant workshop will probably talk about this more than anything. They talk a lot about getting in touch with program officers, getting advice about what kinds of things they're willing to fund. And I think this would be, any place where you're looking at getting funding for international research, it would be a big plus to talk to program officers about that. Now, you folks have done some, you've got some experience with working in China, right?
Yeah, well, we're trying to get money for it. So
The big thing with international ones, and they do have some specific international competitions,
Right.
but if you're just trying to get through the regular PA or investigator initiated, the big key to foreign things is connecting it somehow back to the U.S. I mean, you are being funded by the U.S. government, so they want to know how what you're doing is ultimately going to have something to do with American citizens. But there could be unique situations or opportunities that occur in other countries that can't be duplicated here. And so this is particularly true of issues in, say, westernization or impacts of, cultural developments in rapidly developing countries. You simply can't duplicate those environmental factors here, so it makes sense to go someplace where you can find those factors, but then you need to be able to link that back to, well, how does this inform then, issues that are similar to that, like acculturation or something going on here. So that's the big key that we're finding is you got to make it relevant to the U.S.
And I think part of it is, again, I've been speaking strictly to National Institutes of Health, and I think like National Science Foundation would probably be a little more flexible in international research. And clearly, some of the foundations aren't even target that, so it would depend somewhat on that as well.
You have younger faculty that go for these KO1s. I presume they need to work very carefully with the department to arrange course buyouts if they're going to spend.
They do.
Yeah. I mean,
They should, but they don't always, right?
well, I mean, the KO1s, there has to be an agreement up front, and so I know,
Yeah.
I have not been involved in one of those
Yeah,
negotiations.
because I don't know about your department, but we're sort of maxed out with teaching with everybody on a 45-10 appointment. So if somebody's going 75% research, we got to work something out.
Well, typically that's going to translate into probably one course a year
Yeah,
of teaching.
yeah.
And I think that the challenges there for a young investigator looking at that is probably, and it takes a little while to get a KO1 funded, which is probably good, because the other thing is you have to mix this in with the tenure process. And you probably don't want a faculty member who starts off their first year on the faculty teaching one course a year, and when they go up to tenure, they've taught 5 classes. But a lot of times it's more typical, a person's going to be here for 2 or 3 years, have taught a normal load for that time period, and then get the KO1, and then go to research. The nice thing from a departmental viewpoint, speaking as department chair for a moment, is that with a KO1, you know well ahead of time. You know how much the buyout's going to be, and you know it's going to be for 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
So it gives you flexibility. You can really look at hiring long-term temporary replacements, or looking at other strategies. It isn't this year-to-year thing about, well, will I have money this next year for buyouts?
Yeah.
And that's another thing too, is if you're faculty and you're thinking about moving into this, again, I kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier, every college has a different set of requirements. I know in liberal arts and sciences, I think it's required that if you're buying out of a class, it's 16.5% of your salary.
Right.
And so that, those kinds of things are important to know in terms of budgetary.
Yeah. I think College of Agriculture, on paper, doesn't have a buyout policy, but they actually do if you push it a little bit.
Other questions? Yes.
how much the acceptance rates of RO?
For the RO3s?
Yes.
I really don't know, and I think it would depend. There is some data. I'll try to bring some of that in next time. I don't know exactly. The acceptance rates are better than you might think for a lot of the grants, and they're better for RO3s and for some of the early career grants than they are for the RO1s. The difficulty is that you really are competing against the best. I mean, the people, it's not like, for those, most of you have probably had some experience in, reviewing journal articles, and you occasionally get journal articles that are really bad. You occasionally see a bad grant submitted to an agency for review, but generally speaking, when you're on a review panel, one of the things you're really struck by is how many good ideas are there by good, young, bright investigators, and realizing that a lot of them aren't going to get funded. So, I think with some of the RO3s, I know the Cancer Institute, I give you an example there, we were funding about 50%. And the percentages vary from agency to agency. We haven't talked at all about feedback and stuff. We'll touch on that a little bit later, but like priority scores, can vary greatly from agency to agency. A percentile that's fundable in one agency won't be close to being fundable in another. And so there's a lot of nuances that you're going to learn about as you get into looking at funding from a specific funded source. Well, thank you so much for coming.
And pass the word on. Next week's presentation was originally on one of the flyers that got printed a while ago. It was supposed to be October 13th, but it's actually the 6th, so if you see anybody, spread the word.
It's basically going to be very much like this one, except for it's going to go into more of the nuts and bolts of what an application looks like. But it's still very preliminary.
Times might be available for.
Do you think it's like